Darrell, welcome to this class that we're leading together. Really excited to have you here, man.
Hey, Alex, thanks for having me, man. Love Pod Match. Anything we can do to help support everybody, I'm all for it.
Well, I appreciate that, man. You've definitely been a huge support along the way. Helped me a lot. You're a natural born leader, which is something that I appreciate, and that's actually what I'm really wanting to dive into today because I think that we can all learn a lot from it, myself included. So we're going to talk about becoming a great leader for podcast listeners. And this works on either side of the mic, whether you're a host or a guest. But before we kind of get ahead of ourselves, I'd love to chat about why this is a topic that you cover because if I'm not mistaken, you were in E7 in the military. Am I correct? Is that what the
Yes,
Okay, so in
yes,
E7 in the
senior
military?
leader.
Thanks for your service first off. But I want to know, like, when did speaking come into play? Like, how did that evolve for you? If you don't mind sharing a little bit about that.
No problem at all. So what happens, one thing in the military is you become a leader throughout the ranks, even at the lower level. That first initial leadership responsibility, they are big into you have to be able to speak, you have to be able to relay the message, you have to be able to motivate your team, and all of those things are tied into speaking. So every leadership class that you go to, every leadership training, regardless of what you're learning, there's always different levels of speaking that they add on to it. So by the time you get to the highest level, you have reached all of those plateaus. So it's no doubt that you know how to communicate, all right, the Army's message to whoever you need to communicate it with.
Love that. After military, I think it was after military. When did you become a White House part of the White House Communications Agency? Was that
So
after?
that's no, that was actually during the military, right? That was considered what they call a special assignment. They have special assignments in the military were kind of a little bit different than the traditional assignments. Fort Hood, Fort Texas, Fort Bragg, those type of places. And I was just very blessed and fortunate to be a part of the White House Communication Agency, supporting three different presidents, three different vice presidents, traveling all over the world. But the key, like I always tell everybody, is not as much as what I did there, but what type of impact did you make? And that's one thing I shared on all the different podcasts that, it doesn't matter, where you were, where you are, how do you take those things and then make it work for others, right? Build up other people, because that's what it's all about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you said a key word there that I want to start this conversation off with, which was impact. You're talking about using your experience, where you've been, in a way that it actually serves somebody else. And I think that's a really great place to start. Either side of the mic, that's such an important thing. Like the whole idea of podcasting shouldn't just, I mean, it can be a little bit self gratifying, right? Like it can be something that helps us out and helps us to grow our platform a little bit more. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's about impact that you're leaving on another human being. Would you agree with that statement? And if so, what does that look like, would you say, for you as mostly a podcast guest? I think you've been mostly on that side of the
Mhm.
mic, right?
Absolutely. I've been a guest all the times, and I think you're dead on. I don't care if you're in the podcast industry, interview industry, whatever it is. Yes, you can do your own thing and you can have a little bit of notoriety, right? They say. But if you really want to have that no kidding impact that's going to last way longer than your name, longer than your website, it's about pouring into others, right? It's about planting those seeds, and you don't even know when they're going to grow, how they're going to grow, but knowing that eventually when this thing becomes full bloom, somebody's life is going to be better. And that's why I love what Podmatch is doing, because collectively we don't realize, the impact really that we're making all over the world, right? Everybody knows there's some tough challenges regardless of where you are, but just to be able to, click on a particular site, or somebody just says, hey, I heard this podcast, I just want to recommend it to you. I know that you're kind of in this space right now. And to be able to open up, right, a link, and you hear somebody you don't even know, not even in the same continent, but they're talking about the loss of a child. They're talking about the loss of their sister, right? Veronica, my wife, just did a podcast the other day, and for her to open up like that, first of all, it's good because it's healing for yourself, but then to be able to share with somebody else that, gosh, I was going through that. I'm still going through that. How do I get through these phases and through this time of my life? That's what being a great podcast guest can do, man. You can really shed some light, some strategies, and some tools that can help another human being.
Yeah, I love that side of what you just shared about like really being transparent is just so important. But going back to this
Mhm.
idea of impact, I want to make this really practical because I think that a lot of us, myself included, when I first got started, I didn't actually know what was impactful for somebody else. Like I hadn't done the hard time of figuring out the story necessarily of things that have happened in my life that actually would add value to somebody else. Do you find that that's a phase of self discovery that we all have to go through? Or how can you begin figuring out and honing in on what actually is impactful for somebody who's going to be listening to you?
So I think a lot of, especially on the guest side, it goes back to what is the host looking for? That's the first thing I always ask everybody. What do you want your listeners to get out of this, right? If I'm talking about leadership, I still want to narrow down to what type of leadership things do you want to talk about. If I'm talking about speaking, what type of tools do you want them to walk away with? If it's about purpose, self-discovery, because when you ask those questions, again, like you said, you have to be transparent. And then second, you have to make sure that you're saying those things, because most of the time, the great things that got you either over the hump or to start your own business or whatever those things that have led to success, those really are those things that other people want to hear. So you don't even have to create anything. Just be real about what were those struggles that you had and how did you get past those struggles? And 9 times out of 10, those are the same questions that other people are probably looking to get answers to.
So you did mention something really key here, and it's figuring out who the audience is, right? So talk if you're a guest, it's talking to the host. If you are a host, it's a matter of articulating that to your guest in advance, I'm guessing, right? Do you try to do that right before the episode starts, or do you do some of your own research? Do you ask questions? What does it look like to be really prepared in that way?
So the first thing I do is once I get a match, I definitely go and read again that person's whole write up on Podmatch. Like, hey, got it, good. I see. I have a little idea of kind of what they're looking for and what they like to do, and then I go to previous episodes. Right, who were the former guests? What did they talk about? And it's really interesting because you have some people that have a particular niche, which is great because it's a little bit easier to kind of follow and stay in suit with that. But then there are some, like mostly just stories, where he has a lot of different guests, a lot of different stories, no particular theme or niche. But even then, again, right before we meet, it's like, hey, I just want to make sure, again, what do you want to get out of this? What do you want the listeners to walk with? And even if they say, well, I just want to hear them hear a good story, I got that part. But what about the good story? Do you want them to hear about challenges? Do you want them to hear about how to make it, how to deal with struggles? Because even with the hosts, sometimes they have an idea of what they want, but sometimes they're so great about being flexible. It's like, it's okay to be flexible, but let's still be a little bit more pointed so that we can be flexible with the questions and the going back and forth, but still walk away with the listener saying, wow, even though they were talking back and forth, I got something out of that.
Hmm. Something you mentioned there I think is really key and worth bringing back up was the fact that you ask the host like what's the end result that you're looking to get out of this conversation. I've only had maybe out of the 100 and I don't know 140 episodes I've done my podcast or whatever it is, I think I've only had two people ever ask that. And now I will say I try to be proactive now because I realize that question doesn't come up much. So I actually try to shed a little bit of vision before we get started. Like, hey, here's what the listeners are going to want out of this conversation. So I think as a host, it's important to be proactive, but also as the guest. I think if both sides were really focused on that, it would it would create a lot more value for the person listening, even if it's just a conversation, just to have an idea of like, okay, where are we going? Like, what's the point of the conversation? Do you find that most hosts are really receptive and have an answer to you when you ask them, hey, what's the agenda here?
Oh, absolutely. Because first of all, you know, in fairness to them, they don't really know what they're getting on the other end. I mean, yes, they have the bio, but right, am I trying to sell a book? Am I trying to sell a business? You know what I mean? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
what's the real sincerity of why are you on this podcast? And that's why I love telling people, nope, no books, maybe down the road, I'm working on that. But right now, I just want to help the people. I want the host, right, to feel like, man, that was one of my best conversations. I know my listeners going to get something out of that. That should be all of our goals whenever we're on front of the mic, because at the end of the day, what's going to make people want to come to Podmatch? It's not that I have this platform to talk. I had this platform to ask really cool questions and talk to really cool people. You might start off that way, But I think that if you start thinking a little bit deeper, you're going to find out that you really have a fascinating tool that can really change lives.
And this is really that's the art of becoming a great leader for podcast listeners on either side of the mic is
Mhm.
really figuring out what that is. And Darrell, to share an example for myself here, this happened recently, and it made me feel really good about what I'm doing. You don't always hear like the heart wrenching or heartwarming stories when you're podcasting. Like it's kind of people are listening and they kind of like to be listeners, so you're not always going to hear out. But occasionally, when you do, it's important to remember it and grab onto. I recently had a young lady. She reached out to me about the show, and she said that she had been working for somebody that was somewhat verbally abusive. Like she said some of the stuff that they had
Mm,
said, and like I think some bosses tend to be that way. He was an
yeah.
older male and just maybe hadn't worked around younger females or something like that.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
she had been working with this person for a while, but never could get the courage to leave. Well, one of the guests I had on shared something that actually finally encouraged her to do it. So when she reached out to me, it was her last day at that job. And she was moving into
Hmm.
something new that she was starting on her own that she was really excited about. So that right there, I was like, man, that's how you lead with impact right there. Is you bring that out of a guest, or if you're the guest and the host isn't necessarily bringing it out, do your best to bring that value every chance you can instead of just trying to sell another book, right? Like lead with that value. I think it's just such an important thing.
No, you're exactly right. Because again, that's the magic that everybody creates, whether they're a host or a guest. I mean, there's really something special going on here, right? I don't know if you would call it a movement or whatever it is, but you can really make a lifelong impact. And again, even if you would have never heard that person's story, I'm glad that you did, because it's always good to hear some of those types of things. But even if you never did, that person knows, had I not listened to Podmatch, had I not listened to that particular show, I may still be stuck where I am right now. But now, not only that person has new purpose, somebody's going to ask them. It's just how life is. How did you get here? Right? What gave you the courage, right, to leave that bad situation and realize that there's something better? And they're going to be able to say, right, I was listening to this show, and Chris Cochran was the host, and he asked the person this question. And the way Lorianne answered it, I just never would have thought. I felt like Lorianne was talking directly to me.
That's cool.
And that's what you want. And that's the impact that we can make.
100%. That makes me think about my experience as a host for the first year of my podcast. The main feedback I received was there wasn't enough of Alex involved in it. Now, I was doing a good
Mhm.
job interviewing. I like to think that I really learned really well how to ask good questions and things like that, but I didn't ever throw in any of my own stories. So, something you mentioned earlier, where you talk about transparency being important, I wasn't being transparent because some of the things they're talking about, yeah, I struggled with them, but I was just kind of like, hey, what would you do if you're in this case? And like, I dive a little bit deeper, but I never actually explored that. So I think something that podcast hosts can learn is when the guest is sharing the story, don't lie or just try to agree, but throw in something that maybe relates to it for yourself, because I find that listeners connect with that. Once I started doing that, my listenership grew a lot. More people that were listening they've been listening for a full year finally started reaching out to me because they felt like now they could actually relate to me a little bit more. And so when hosts are doing that, do you recommend guests to leave a little bit of space for the host to respond as well, or are you just trying to get as much of your story out there as you can?
Absolutely leave that space, right? That's one thing as a master certified life coach. You realize open ended questions and allowing the space, right? Sometimes just as humans, right? Right. We always feel like everything needs to be filled, right? Oh no, dead air is bad. No, 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 no. Allow thoughts to happen during that time. Allow that reflection. Because a lot of time the mind, especially if it's something that was challenging, right? It's digging deep back into, man, I thought I buried that thing, right? But now that Barbie's asked this question, I guess I better answer it again, right? But what you don't realize is when you answer that question and it comes up, it helps somebody else, right? That's why when I talk to the host, they'll say something like, man, what was it like working at the White House? All right, always flipping and say, working at the White House is just like working in any other high level position. It comes with its own challenges, it comes with its own rewards. But the key is we as individuals get to be a part of that story, right? So I'll raise reflected from, because I don't want anybody to listen to it like, well, he worked at the White House. I can never do that. This is not the show for me. But when we start talking about, here's what I dealt with, they're like, wait a minute. I don't work at the White House, but I have those type of challenges. Oh, I know what that type of pressure is like. So now you start opening up the dialogue. It's okay, let me listen a little bit more and see what happens. And then it's like, oh, wait, I can use that strategy. Oh, wait a minute, I can go pick up a mentor, right? I don't have to be in the military to have a mentor or an accountability partner or those things. Everything that he's saying, I can do that tomorrow. And I think that's what builds those connections where people remember those. Because you think about any speech that any of us have ever heard, you might not even remember, say, if they had three key points,
Mm-hmm.
but if they shared a story and that story resonated with you, it's like, you know what? I don't know what Alex talked about, but I remember when he said this story about, right, the mom who went through the burning building and her hands was burned and her son was ashamed of her going through high school. But when he got to college, he realized why his mom's arms were burnt. And you remember that story. And then you tie in the story had to do with appreciation. The story had to do with a mom's sacrifice. You're going to remember those, and it's going to be impactful.
Yeah, you're right. The stories are really important to get in there. And you talked about being transparent with these stories. Like they've got to be true. We can't just become
Yes.
storytellers or making things up. I wanted to ask you a question about, before I move along here, I want to ask you a question about being transparent. How transparent is too transparent? How do you determine that line? Because I've definitely listened to some podcasts where, man, it's just maybe that's the idea of the podcast, but I'm like, whoa, that's way like I didn't need to know the little details there, like that went a little over the top. And again, some people maybe that's the idea of it, but I think that there's probably some healthy medium of like this is transparent enough to tell a good story without getting into the stuff that maybe people don't want to hear necessarily. I'm not trying to be rude by saying that, but do you find that there's a line that needs to be found?
Oh, absolutely. Because the bottom line is, unless you're trying to look for shock and value, that's what you're going to get. But if you're trying to get redemption and restoration, then you want to definitely stay on that line of, okay, I want to share the challenge, but I do not need to share, those details. You're exactly right. Sometimes, that's that too much information, right? That
Mm-hmm.
is a true comment. Everybody doesn't need to know the details, right? They just need to know the overarching challenge, right? Here's how I dealt with that challenge, and here's the result of that challenge. But you're right. We do not have to be as detailed. And sometimes the challenge is, and it's just an individual thing. Um, it's like we're so proud and happy that we made it through that moment. We really do the best intention. We just want other people to get through that. And that's fine. But I always say, look at the intent, right? Is your intent to help somebody, or is your intent to show off how good you are? Because if the intent is to help somebody, they don't need the details. They just don't.
Talking about just being out there to help somebody makes me think about myself. So, thinking about being a leader for my listeners, there was often where I would withhold a story because I wasn't through that journey yet. Like I was still just there. But you talk about just being out there far enough that you can grab someone's hand and bring them along with you. I think a big part of being transparent is sharing what you have going on as well, with, of course, being mindful about the details. Like if it's something you have going on, like just imagine you're in a lawsuit, like don't talk about anything that's to get anyone in trouble and how mad you are at the other person, but just share, like, I'm going through a really bad struggle. Like, here's kind of where I'm at. As long as the story, again, is like one step further than somebody can add that value. I think, especially from the host side, because we don't always know what the guests are going to share. But if you have something that you're even kind of stuck with, that's what leadership is. It's helping somebody be just a little bit further along than they are. And I think by adding that level of transparency, honesty, and having the integrity involved in it, I think that you are going to find that you're going to serve a listeners really well on the host side of the mic, which also complements the guest side as well.
And the great thing about that is all the great hosts, they have similar types of questions, right? They're like, Joseph, what did you learn about yourself when you went through that process? Tom, what was it like when you got on the other end of that challenge? Right? Again, those open-ended questions, because now if I'm going through that, you just gave me some hope that, oh, okay, I can have the same success that Joseph had. I can have the same success that Tom had, right? Even though I'm in the middle of whatever it is, right? There is a glimpse of hope that obviously this is not, the end of the story. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. And even though I don't see it, but I just heard somebody in a similar situation talk about the other side. So now I've gotten just a little bit more hope. So yeah, I think you definitely, as a host, ask those again open-ended type questions that anybody can learn from.
So now I'm thinking about something else that kind of plays off of this.
Mhm.
The idea of confidence and being a know-it-all, because there's two very different pieces there. And I've definitely heard guests and hosts that I would put in categories of both those things, as someone who's really confident, but somebody who is also a know-it-all. Can you kind of explain the difference a little bit and how you find the happy medium?
I'm gonna make it real simple. If there is more we's, it's confidence. If it's more I, it's the opposite. It's as simple as that. Even those people that think they made it on their own, you still should have some type of humility that, golly, at least I got something from somebody, right? Even if I did take my plan and the bank filed it away, can you at least thank the bank person, right, for putting the loan behind your success? But if it's all about, I did this and I had this revelation and I found, it's like, okay, got it, right? And what they don't realize is you're really kind of self-serving, because when people start hearing that, even though that might not be your intention, they're going to walk away with, oh, I know why they got on Barbie show. They're trying to just sell this, even though that might not be your reason, but that's the message that they're getting. But when you're talking about, man, I made it to the White House, I was scared, I was nervous, but you know what helped me out? I reached out for some mentors, right? And in the midst of reaching out for those mentors, I met this person named Lorianne. And let me tell you how great Lorianne was. Lorianne sat down with me. She talked me through some things, right? She didn't just have one talk with me. She gave me some tips and strategies and said, hey, let's talk back in about 90 days, right? That that's when you know the difference, right? It needs to be about we and us, the team, right? Here's what they did, right? My job as a leader was really just to, right, try to get rid of some of those stumbling blocks, but they were the ones that actually made it happen. So I think that's where that line is. It needs to be more we and less I.
So going back to this idea of confidence, if you're a podcast host who's just getting started, most podcast hosts that just get started are lacking confidence in their own ability to be a podcast host. That was my story. The first 30 episodes I did, I was nervous as I could get out. Felt like I probably shouldn't be doing it, right? But the thing that kept me going was remembering that it's going to impact one person. If it impacts one person,
Yes.
it's worth my time. And I still this day, I remind myself of that. It actually keeps me from getting nervous now, because instead of being like, oh, it's for my however many people are listening to my show, I never say that. I say, no, it's for the one person that I might be able to help with this. It's just a maybe. That takes a lot of pressure off of me. But what do you say to the host that's maybe struggling with the confidence to be doing what they're doing? Or like Darrell, like you're a very accomplished individual. I don't have even part of what you've accomplished in your time. Like, how can you tell somebody to be less nervous and a little bit more confident when they're jumping into an interview with somebody like you?
I would say that, especially for somebody that's new, um, again, it's so many great shows on Podmatch. I would really take the time to just listen to quite a few of them, because as you start listening more, you'll see everybody's good, right? But then there's some people you just like, wow, I just really like how they flow. Man, I really like how she allowed space, right? Look at what people are doing that you like. Second, what you feel comfortable adding to your style, right? Everybody's style doesn't fit you, but I guarantee there's something that somebody does well that you could adapt to. So I think that's one of the things is, again, it's almost like an invisible mentor. You're reaching out and listening to people that you look up to and say, wow, I want to have that same impact. And then trying to see how you can make that fit. And then you practice. That's another thing. It's like, it's okay to practice before you have your real interview, right? Whether you have a friend, a spouse, like, hey, I got this guy named Alex, he's gonna be on my show next week. I want to run some questions past you, right? Sometimes we're just so like, well, I don't want to ask my wife, but she's gonna be, real critical. That's why you have your spouse. They are supposed to be critical, right? They're gonna sharpen those little dull edges around you and make you, greater than what you think, right? So again, sharing, and if you're not married, you always have that best friend, somebody that you can go to middle of the night. It's like, hey, I know you sleep, but you already said I can call you. I'm calling you, right? I got this interview tomorrow. I'm nervous. I really need to just run these questions past you. So again, being vulnerable enough to say, you know what, I'm good at this, but I want to be better, right? And then for those that may be interviewing, people that are authors and wrote these great books or have these huge and outstanding companies, right? Find the questions, right, that the audience may want to walk away with, right? Like they already know that within the first couple of questions that, they wrote this amazing book, right? But maybe you go a little bit deeper, right? What inspired them to write the book? What do they want their listeners to walk away when they read that book, right? Those are some good questions you can ask. And then you may say, well, there may be some people in the audience that want to write a book, right? What tips would you share with them, especially if there's some challenges in the beginning? Because I don't care how successful you are, there's always challenges. Who doesn't want to hear that piece? Because again, it may help somebody down the road.
So there's a quote by Mark Twain that's always really stood out to me. And he said that there are two type of speakers in the world, those that get nervous and those that are liars. And I think for the most part, that's pretty true. What do you say to somebody who's maybe struggling with just getting a little bit nervous beforehand? I know you gave some good practical advice for seeking guidance from other people, but what's something that you've always been able to do that's helped you calm down, like something mentally that you do? I don't know if you have a preparation you do or something, but I'd love for you just to kind of share what people can do to, when they step into it, be fully present, be there without all the concern and stuff like that.
So definitely on the speaking piece, one thing I learned a long time ago, somebody always said, pick that one person in the audience in the front row, right? And especially not the one that's smiling, right? But the one that's like, okay, Agnes, tell me why I should be here. Why should I keep listening to you, right? And then you just gotta take it from there, and you kind of use that person as a temperature gauge, right? It's like, okay, they smirked a little bit, they moved a little bit. Okay, I think I'm getting somewhere, right? And then the other piece is don't fight the nervousness. A lot of times I think we are so like, I got to control this, right? I got to get rid of it. Any great speaker will tell you, you never get rid of the nervous. They're always there. So one of the things I was on, I think it was Peter's podcast about being a great speaker, is like, I know the butterflies are going to be there, right? So let me at least negotiate with the butterflies. Hey, for this next 30, 25 minutes, all right, I'm not going anywhere. You're not going anywhere. Can we at least agree to just fly in formation for these 25 minutes, right? Let's just have this unified energy that we can both kind of work off of, right? Got to negotiate those things because the nervousness is not going to go away. And if it does go away, you're really setting yourself up for future failure because you're going to be cocky. You're going to get a message across, but you may not get the best message across.
Such a good point. It makes me think about what I was talking about a little bit earlier about having that one person in mind for your list, like your one listener. So for me, it's my avatar. So his name's Adam. He's fictitious, but I kind of gave him a whole backstory and stuff. And you talked about looking at one person in the front row. When I'm getting ready to do a podcast, I'm feeling like overly nervous. I love the idea of getting the butterflies to fly in formation. I'm gonna start talking myself through that as well. But I always just kind of think and focus on Adam. I'm always like, okay, this is for Adam. It's not for anyone else who overhears it. It's not for the guest. It's for impacting Adam. And it kind of goes back to that one word that we keep on saying, which is impact. So I believe becoming a great leader for podcast listeners comes back to that impact that you're able to leave. And man, this has been a really insightful conversation. I've got some really good notes here for myself. Before we end, and I'll ask about where we can find you, but before that, do you have any final thoughts for everybody here? And then we'll open up into some Q&A in a few minutes here.
Absolutely. Like I tell every podcast host when I get ready to get off, they always say, you got any last questions? I'm like, sure. And I always ask them, why did you get into podcasting? And they're like, whoa, nobody's ever asked me that. One reason I ask them that, because I want to make sure they remember the why. Sometimes we forget the why, regardless of what industry we're in, right? We get so successful or we get so bummed out that we want to quit right before the miracle's about to happen, right? So I always like to ask them, why did you get into podcasting? And then whatever reason they tell me, I just remind them that, you don't know who's going to listen to this. You don't know who's going to be impacted by this. So don't let, yourself get too high. Don't let yourself get too low, but know that whatever you're doing, whether you're on the guest side or especially on the host side, you are making a difference, right? There's a reason that something inside of you said, hey, I want to start this podcast for XYZ audience, or I want to start this podcast to help other mothers, right? Or single dad. Whatever that reason was, I would say there's probably something that's really needed, right? So don't ever think that, oh my God, this is my 150th episode about single dads. That's okay, because episode 151 may be the one that's going to help, like you said, the avatar, right? So as long as that passion is still there, continue to fight the good fight, because again, everybody knows there's so much negativity in the world. That's one good thing I love about podcasting, right? You can be that one bright spot wherever you are, and you have no idea who's going to listen to it.
Love it, man. That's great. Where can everyone find you?
Facebook, Alliance Seminars Coaching, website, allianceseminars.org. And it's so funny, right? Because people are like, oh my gosh, everything you're saying, like these are like, $500 nuggets, $1,000. I'm like, yeah, one day I'll get to there, but right now it's not about the money, right? I'm okay. It's more about the impact. And my whole life has been that way, whether it's in the military or the contractor, now working for the government. The impact has always been so gratifying, right? I was driving my daughter to her practice the other day, and it was a guy he's getting ready to go to some type of business program, but he needed a recommendation. So I took that time to tell my daughter, I was like, hey, when you become successful, there's different levels of success, right? You never get to the end, but one of the levels that you want is when you can go and help somebody else, right? And to me, that's what Podmatch and podcasters are doing. You're helping somebody else be successful.
Love it, man. Well, I appreciate you spending this time with us and sharing your wisdom. We're going to open up for Q&A, but thank you for being here,
Sure.
man. Appreciate it.
No problem. No problem at all.